Victims. 1. Ada, said Miss Fletcher solemnly. He's asked me to go to the pictures again tonight. Mabel, I never, returned her sister, not exactly absent-mindedly, but as one who has heard the same thing before. So she had. Major Trimmer had lodged with the Mrs. Fletcher for the past 3 months, and had several times taken Mabel to the pictures. At first, he had suggested that Ada should come too, but this had been immediately and definitely squashed by the younger sister. Ada doesn't really care about going to the pictures, thanks all the same, Major. She's one who likes a nice book and the fireside, when her work's done, being on her feet so much. Now I'm quite different. I like a bit of life. Many's the time I've asked Ada to come along out on the front and listen to the band, and go and have a look at the pier when it's crowded with visitors in the summer. But she doesn't care about it. On the whole, this was fairly true. Ada didn't much want to go out with Mabel, who walked too fast for her, and after cooking most of the day and giving the girl a hand with the washing up, it was a relief to kick off her shoes and sink down into the wicker armchair in the basement sitting room reserved by the sisters for their own use. But that was in the summer, when they counted on having a ceaseless succession of lodgers and the house was full, overfull, Ada considered, when it came to the ironing board laid over the bath with a mattress on it, and the first floor fronts squeezing 4 children and 2 grown-ups into 2 beds and a cot. In the winter, when things were slack and not more than 3 or 4 people to cook for, it was different. She'd have enjoyed a visit to the pictures then. Sometimes she and Mabel did go. They had not done so since the advent of Major Fletcher. He had arrived just after Christmas, and it was now the end of March. It seemed that his doctor had recommended him to try the air of St. Bray for insomnia. It was, the Major amusingly told his landladies, the well-polished windows and the clean doorstep of number 6 that had caused him to select it from amongst all the other houses along the front that also bore the announcement, apartments. The reward of virtue, Mabel always replied to this. It was really the virtue of Dolly, the girl, who polished the windows and cleaned the step, but the reward was certainly the Mrs. Fletcher's, and particularly Mabel's. To have a lodger at all, in the winter, was a piece of luck, and the Major seemed almost too good to be true. He had the ground floor front sitting room and the first front bedroom. He settled up his bill every Saturday morning punctually. He never disputed extras. He was quite content to have cold supper twice a week. He never, unlike many elderly gentlemen, tried to waste the girl's time with nonsense or worse, and he was always in his room by 10 o'clock every night, and the light out 20 minutes later. In addition to all this virtue, the Major, in the opinion of his landladies, possessed charm. Always a pleasant word or a joke or a compliment to Ada's cooking, and as the weeks went on, he and Mabel took to holding quite lengthy conversations, at first about such subjects as the royal family, politics, and the effects of St. Bray upon the Major's insomnia, and later on, more personal topics, the chance of a good summer season, and the difference that this would make to the hard-working Mrs. Fletcher, and then, actually, the Major's nephew in the Air Force, and his young unmarried nieces. Eventually, he showed their photographs to Mabel, and that of their mother, his only surviving near relative. Mabel admitted to Ada afterwards that the young people were well enough, but that she hadn't cared much for the look of the sister. It was a hard sort of face, she couldn't help feeling, although naturally she hadn't told the Major this. The next stage had been the Major's invitations to the pictures, and with the acceptance of these, it became definitely established that he was Mabel's friend. Ada didn't mind. She knew well the difference between Mabel's status and her own. Number 6 Ocean Parade was Mabel's house, bought with Mabel's savings, and the furniture in it practically all belonged to Mabel. It had been left her by her last case, an old lady, and had enabled her to retire from nursing and set up in lodgings for herself. Ada had no savings at all. She had kept house for a widowed uncle, and when the uncle had unexpectedly married again, at the age of 66, he had considered Ada's 15 years of service handsomely repaid by a cuckoo clock and a £5 note. It was then that Mabel had come forward and offered Ada a home with her. She was to live in Mabel's house, use Mabel's furniture, eat Mabel's food, and, in return, do the cooking for Mabel's lodgers. Ada was an excellent cook, and that was more than could be said for any servant nowadays. She accepted the offer, indeed. She could hardly have done otherwise, for she was getting on towards 60, and it wouldn't be too easy to find a post she could undertake, and came to number 6. She had been there 4 years, and the arrangement was succeeding better than one might have expected. Mabel's temper, of course, was something chronic. It always had been, even as a girl, but Ada had become accustomed to it, and could stolidly go on rolling pastry or scouring saucepans, whilst Mabel screamed at her. Occasionally she screamed back, but not often. Since the advent of Major Trimmer, however, screaming had miraculously disappeared from life in the basement of number 6. Mabel was becoming quite different. Even her looks were improving. She had always been handsome and young-looking for her years, and now she and Ada agreed she might easily have passed for 40. She had bought a bottle of stuff for her hair that gave a wonderful glitter to it, almost like brass, and had had a new dress made by a woman who charged amazingly low prices because she was a widow with 2 delicate children and had to make her living and theirs. "He's asked me to go to the pictures again tonight." Mabel's tone was frankly triumphant. No wonder. Neither of the sisters had, so far, admitted it aloud to one another, but it was really beginning to look rather as though the Major was in earnest. And why not? He was getting on, he owned to 61, but the Mrs. Fletcher were both quite certain that he was older than that, and he wouldn't want to remain in furnished apartments forever. He possessed the greatest, most wonderful asset in the world, a settled income, for which he was not obliged to work. Why shouldn't he buy a nice little house, somewhere near London? He had said he liked Putney, and knew it well, and settle there, with a sensible middle-aged wife to look after him. Ada didn't dare say a word about it to Mabel openly, but she couldn't help looking at her with a significant smile when Mabel marched into the kitchen just before starting for the picture house with her escort wearing a spray of pink carnations and maidenhair fern pinned into the front of her green artificial silk jumper. No need to ask where they'd come from. The proud, self-conscious, incredulous expression on her face would have made it quite clear, even if Ada had not known perfectly well that Mabel would as soon have jumped off the end of the pier into the sea as have spent money on buying flowers. "Well," said Ada rallyingly, "have a good time and behave yourself." "What's on this week?" "That fellow that gets such a salary," said Mabel. "You know, I read you in the Sunday picture paper." Ada nodded. She had forgotten the name of the film star, but she remembered the exclamations of Mabel and herself over the figures quoted in the paper and the resentment of both at the inequalities of life. "Don't wait up, Ada, without you want to. I've got the key. Leave the kettle on, for a nice cup of hot tea when I get back. If you go up to bed, don't forget to roll back the rug, and put the cat out before you go, and see that the girl has her light out. I'll not have her burning my gas just so that she may read some silly story in bed, instead of getting her sleep while she can, and coming down sharp at 6:15 in the morning." "All right," said Ada, not listening to a word. Mabel swept a last look round the kitchen. "Is that, Ada? Whatever to goodness is that?" Mabel's finger pointed accusingly at a loaded plate, standing uncovered on the window ledge. "Do you mean to tell me that you meant that for the girls' supper?" "It's all right, Mabel," said Ada feebly. "All right. I should think it was all right, giving away about 1/4 of a pound of good cheese and half a loaf of bread. And I suppose that jam's for her, too? If ever there was a soft one, Ada. I do really think you're a perfect fool." "It isn't such a lot, really," Ada protested. Her sister, without any reply, snatched up a knife, cut the bread and the cheese in half, wiped the knife on a piece of newspaper, scraped away the jam from the plate, and transferred it to a saucer. She held the knife under the kitchen tap and wiped it dry before speaking. "You'd ruin that girl in a week if I'd let you," she remarked. "Now mind, directly she's down from turning back the beds, she's to clear up in the sitting room and in here, and then have her supper and straight off to bed. Don't encourage her to start gossiping and chattering, whatever you do." "Oh, all right." Ada felt that on the whole, thanks to Major Trimmer and the carnations, she'd been let off lightly. "Ta-ta, Mabel." "Bye," said Mabel quite amiably, and she pounded up the stairs to the front hall to set forth in state from the front door with the Major. Ada unconsciously exhaled a sigh, expressive of relief from tension, and all her movements became slower as she padded about the kitchen on her flat, tired feet. Presently the maid, Dolly, came running downstairs. "In here, Dolly," shouted Ada. Dolly came in. She was a neat, cheerful little thing, only 20, and the best servant they had ever had. She had come to them at 18 and Mabel had trained her. She was honest and obedient and quick at her work. Ada had no fault to find with her, but Mabel said she was a chatterbox and also resented the size of her appetite. "There's your supper, Dolly. And you can have that saucer of jam if you like." "Thank you, miss." Dolly spread a sheet of newspaper over a corner of the kitchen table and sat down to her meal. Ada had brewed a pot of strong black tea and now poured out 2 large cupfuls and joined her. There was never any time of the day or night when Ada was not ready for a cup of strong tea. "Miss Fletcher's gone to the pictures, then, miss?" "Yes." The major wouldn't take no for an answer, said Ada proudly, although as a matter of fact the major had been given no opportunity of taking anything but yes for an answer. "Cooler," said Dolly. Ada laughed indulgently. The hot tea, the warm kitchen, she had made up the fire again the moment she had heard the door shut behind Mabel and the major, combined to produce in her an agreeable sense of relaxation. Dolly was a nice girl, not one to take advantage, and it did one good to have a few cheerful words with somebody before going off to bed after a heavy day. Therefore, she did not snub Dolly when Dolly remarked confidentially that it seemed as though the major was regularly taken up with Miss Fletcher, like. "It does, really," Ada agreed. "Well, it's natural, Dolly. A gentleman likes to have someone to talk to, all about his little ailments and one thing and another. And my sister's always been a great one for the men. Popular, I mean. As a girl, she had them all after her. If you'd ever told me, in those days, that she'd get left an old maid, well, there, I shouldn't have believed you." "Perhaps she won't get left, after all," said Dolly audaciously. "Dolly, whatever are you thinking of?" Ada demanded in tones of reproof. But she was not really vexed. It was actually encouraging to find that Dolly, also, had noticed what she had noticed and was hoping what she was hoping. "Perhaps it isn't my place to pass any remark, miss," faltered Dolly, "but I'm sure I thought it was as good as settled." "Really, I did." "Do you mean?" "Miss Fletcher and the major, miss." "Oh." Ada couldn't help wanting the conversation to go on, although she knew that Dolly was presuming and ought to be checked. "Everyone in the parade houses is talking about it, miss. Really and truly they are," urged Dolly, as though this afforded some excuse for her own indiscretion. "Why, I've been asked if the day is fixed, by more than one too." "Have you?" gasped Ada. And in her own mind she thought, then there must be something in it. If other people, who don't even live in the house, are beginning to think things, it can't be just us imagining. "I'm sure, miss, no one couldn't wish for a nicer gentleman than the major, now could they?" "No, indeed, Dolly. So considerate always, and regular in his ways, and quite the gentleman. He must be ever so well off, too. If ever I run out to get any little thing for him, it's always, 'Keep the change, Dolly,' and he never dreams of counting it. He can afford not to, he's no one but himself to think about. Not that I don't think it's very generous, mind. I do." But Ada could not help also thinking that the major would have to curb those lavish instincts if he ever really did marry Mabel. "I suppose, miss, he's got a house of his own somewhere?" "Not at present, Dolly. He's spent a number of years abroad, of course, and I fancy he's made a sort of a home with his sister, Mrs. Ransom, who's a widow. But her family's growing up now, and I dare say the major feels he'd like to make a change." "They wouldn't live in St. Bray, would they, miss?" Dolly inquired, her ideas several steps in advance of any that Ada had as yet permitted herself. It's early days to be talking of anything like that. But the topic once started had a fascination. "Of course, the major likes town. So does my sister, for that matter. She's always said she'd rather live in town than anywhere. And there's ever such a lot of these little labor-saving houses round about London now." Ada looked round her with startled eyes as another thought came into her mind. "I'm sure I don't know what had happened to all this. I suppose it would all be sold. The furniture's good and this house is worth more than it was when Mabel bought it. Wouldn't you keep it on, miss?" No, I don't think so," said Ada, pretending to reflect, although she had no ownership whatever in the house or the furniture. "I'd rather go somewhere smaller, much smaller, and perhaps help things out a bit with running teas in the summer," she said, voicing a vague ambition that had hovered somewhere in the background of her mind for years. "Wouldn't that be lovely?" Dolly exclaimed with youthful enthusiasm. "The Charists don't often get scones and cakes like yours, miss. And if you'd a bit of a garden, it'd be ever so nice, tea out of doors and homemade jams and everything." Her optimism was infectious. "I'd want a younger pair of legs to help me, Dolly. I'd have to be in my kitchen, keeping the kettle going and all that. You'd have to run about with the plates and trays." "Kua, I'd love it." "Would you really?" "Truly I would, miss. It's the stairs that get me so tired here and polishing all that oilcloth." And besides, Ada knew very well what "and besides" was. Mabel was hard on the girl and shouted at her unnecessarily, besides keeping a very sharp eye open to see that she did the maximum of work on the minimum of food, recreation, and sleep. At this last thought, Ada started and looked at the clock. "Well, it's long after 9. Go along up, Dolly. I'll see to the things. Hurry up, there's a good girl." Dolly obediently went to seek the narrow, unventilated slip of attic in which there was room for scarcely anything at all excepting her camp bed, her tin box, and an enamel jug and basin that had to stand upon the window ledge. Ada, although fully intending to do as she had said she would and see to the things, leant back again in her creaky chair and allowed drowsy, fantastic ideas to take possession of her. Supposing the Major really did, and Mabel got married after all, and married so comfortably, too. Perhaps the Major would want to furnish his house himself. He'd said something about having things in store. Mabel might be so well off that she'd let Ada take some of the number 6 furniture away at a bargain price. Old things, that would look shabby in the new house. And 1 or 2 things really did belong to Ada. If her eldest brother would help a bit, and he was doing well in business, she might really set up that little tea garden, somewhere just outside St. Bray. Fancy Dolly saying she'd like to come with her. Of course it wouldn't be nearly such a hard place for the girl as this one was. Ada wouldn't drive her morning, noon, and night as Mabel did. She liked Dolly, one could almost make a companion of her, really. And there'd be nobody to make a fuss if the girl did get down 10 minutes late on a winter's morning. Now that one came to think of it, there'd no longer be any necessity for Ada herself to yawn and groan her way out of bed at the sound of Mabel's inexorable alarm clock every morning. Ada was half asleep by the time Mabel came in and started up guiltily at her sister's entrance. Mabel, however, was not angry. She was excited and voluble, and explained that the Major had insisted on treating her to a fish and chips supper after the cinema. "Fancy, Ada, he kept on wanting to know why I hadn't married, and saying that he wished he'd met me years ago. If it wasn't such ridiculous nonsense, one might really think." Mabel's voice died away, and she did not finish the sentence. 2. From the very moment that she opened the door and took in the telegram, Ada felt that it meant trouble. Something, she declared afterwards, seemed to tell her so. She showed it to Dolly, who was halfway up the stairs rubbing the banisters, and bade her take the telegram into Major Trimmer, quietly eating his midday chop with mashed potatoes in the front sitting room. When she went down the basement stairs again, Mabel, her head tied up in a handkerchief, popped out of their sitting room and asked, "What was that, Belle?" "A telegram for the Major. Dolly's taking it in to him." "Oh," said Miss Fletcher sharply. And a moment later she added, "That's the Major's bell. Here, give me the tray, I'll take up his second course." The girls got all behindhand this morning, fancy doing her stairs at this hour. Mabel snatched up the tray, with its rice pudding in a frilled pie dish, and went off with it. When she came down again, her face was a deep, fiery red. "Whatever do you think, Ada, the Major's sister, that Mrs. Ransom, or whatever her name is, wants to motor over here for lunch tomorrow. He says she's staying in the neighborhood with friends." "How many of them will there be?" inquired Ada practically, her mind at once flying to the question of a joint of meat sufficiently large. "Just herself, from what he said, and perhaps one of the nieces. I must say, it seems a bit funny, not giving any more notice than that. Why, he might have been going out for the day himself, or anything. As it is, I'm sure I don't know how we shall manage with an extra couple of places to lay and all the rest of it, with that nursery party on the top floor." For the remainder of the day, Mabel dashed about more energetically even than usual. Everything in the house was rubbed and dusted and brushed and polished and scrubbed. The children on the top floor front were sharply spoken to about bringing nasty, dirty seaweed upstairs, to the great indignation of their governess, who already hated Miss Fletcher. And at 5:45 next morning, Mabel personally hunted Dolly out of her bed and into the kitchen. It was a warm, moist day, and Ada, panting over the gas oven, suggested that everyone would prefer a cold midday dinner. But Mabel would not hear of it. "Yes, I dare say, and have this Mrs. What's-her-name saying that we can't even send up a hot meal in the middle of the day. Have a cold sweet if you like, Ada, but you'll just kindly roast that meat and serve it up hot, complete with gravy and a dish of potatoes and another of veg. And that's that." That was that, as Ada knew only too well it would be, when she heard that particular tone in her sister's voice. Soon after 12 o'clock, a car drew up at the front doorstep of number 6, a step scoured to dazzling point by Dolly that morning at Mabel's command. Ada, as quickly as her feet, that always swelled in the spring, would permit, hurried to the window. "Come back," hissed Mabel fiercely, behind her. "Don't be so undignified." "Aren't you going to receive her, Mabel?" said Ada, as she obediently drew back and loosed her clutch of the Nottingham lace curtain. "Not without I'm asked for." "Why ever should I go up, I should like to know, just because a permanent let has a visitor to see him?" Nevertheless, Ada saw that Mabel had newly done her hair and put on her Sunday skirt and new green silk jumper. And every time a bell rang she jumped nervously, although it was Dolly's business to answer all the bells that rang from upstairs. The Major's bell, however, did not ring, and at 1 o'clock Dolly carried up dinner to his sitting room. She came down again, looking very pink and excited. "The Major's compliments, Miss Fletcher, and he'll be very pleased if you'd come up and drink a cup of coffee after dinner and meet Mrs. Ransom." And in quite a different manner, a less official manner, so to speak, Dolly added, to Ada, "Major Trimmer'll be ever so much obliged, miss, if you'll send up coffee for them after dinner, and he's sorry he forgot to mention it earlier." "Tell him it's no trouble," said Ada, almost automatically. "And reach me that bottle of camp from off of the sideboard, Dolly, before you go." "Thanks." She hardly dared look at her sister. It was all so exciting and agitating. His wanting Mabel to meet his sister, like that, surely meant business? "How about your dinner, Mabel?" she ventured. "I'll keep it hot between 2 plates, shall I?" The Mrs. Fletcher never had their own meal until after their lodgers had finished. "I don't want anything. You can keep back one of those jam tartlets for me. That'll be sufficient." Mabel stalked out of the room, only looking back to tell Dolly not to dawdle, but get on with the trays for upstairs. Nevertheless, Dolly sucked in her underlip and opened her eyes expressively at Ada before she went. And a brief vision of the little tea garden and Dolly and herself drinking cups of strong tea after a busy, successful afternoon danced before Ada's hot and weary eyes as she dished up vegetables and Yorkshire pudding and jam tartlets. It was 3 o'clock before the washing up was finished, and Dolly, whose afternoon out it was, dismissed by Ada. "Perhaps you'll have some news for me when I gets in tonight," caroled Dolly in her impudent young voice. Ada pretended not to hear. She was somehow feeling vaguely worried and uneasy. Mabel was still upstairs, and when Ada stood in the hall and listened as intently as she could, she heard the voice of the strange woman, Mrs. Ransom, talking hard. But she was not able to distinguish any words through the closed door. Perceiving that she was wasting her time, Ada moved away as quietly as she could and returned downstairs to brew herself a cup of tea. While she was still waiting for the kettle to boil, she heard Mabel coming down and looked up anxiously. Her sister went straight to the sitting room and banged the door. Ada's heart sank. She did not dare go in for some time. When at last she did so, it was to find Mabel, still very much flushed, rapidly making up accounts at her desk. She signed imperatively for silence, and Ada sat down in the wicker armchair, scarcely daring to breathe. At last Mabel pushed her papers into a drawer, shut it with a push that made Ada start, and looked up. "That Mrs. Somebody, Major Trimmer's sister, wants him to go over to those friends of hers, people on the other side of the bay, for the weekend." "Whatever for?" "Don't ask me. How should I know?" "Is he going?" "Oh, of course he's going." They're sending the car over for him at 11 o'clock tomorrow, and he'll be back in time for supper Monday night. What's she like? Ventured Ada. Mabel gave a most unpleasant laugh. Like a hyena in a Macintosh. If I had teeth like hers, I'd have 'em taken out and a new set put in, whatever it was going to cost me. I must say, I'd never have believed she was the Major's sister, never. Why, she doesn't even look like a lady. Wasn't she nice to you, Mabel? Ada, you're nothing but a fool. Do you suppose that I want a woman like that to be nice to me? Said Miss Fletcher furiously. And on Monday morning the blow fell. The Major, in a charming letter addressed to Mabel, informed her with immense regret that he would not be returning. His doctor was anxious to have him under his own eye for the present, in order to make the most of the great benefit that his health had received from the weeks spent at St. Bray. The Major would never forget the kindness of Miss Fletcher and her sister, and hoped not to lose sight of them altogether. He enclosed a check in lieu of a week's notice, and would be most grateful if his belongings might be packed up and sent to his sister's address in London, carriage forward. Enclosed was a small present, £2, for Miss Fletcher's most capable and obliging little maid. It was all over. Somehow, the formidable sister had heard, or guessed, what was happening, and she had swooped down upon the Major and taken him off, as one might rescue, just in time, a victim. And there was poor Mabel, who had really begun to expect a magnificent release from her hard, grinding life of work, but it was almost impossible to go on feeling sorry for Mabel, who vented her bitterness in rage and abuse. Night after night, in the small room that they shared, she drove Ada to tears by her continual nagging and fault-finding. The dream of the little tea garden faded, never to be revived again. As for Dolly, she was told of Major Trimmer's present, but only 5 shillings of it came into her eager hands direct. £2 was a ridiculous sum for a girl in Dolly's position, and Miss Fletcher would take care of it for her until she needed it for something sensible. Dolly didn't like it at all, but Miss Fletcher looked so furious and spoke so sharply that she dared not protest. But it did seem hard, Dolly thought, that she and poor Miss Ada should be the sufferers, just because a silly old maid had had a disappointment.